I know in some of these talks, the speakers sort of preview the film and give you the plot line and all of that. And I'm not going to do that because it feels like there would be a lot of spoilers there, and I'm sure there are some first-time viewers here. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the film and how it relates to the topic of work in America and what was going on in the late 1950s, which is the period, this film came out in 1960, so the period that this film is about. And then we're going to take a little bit of a trip through work in America, and I'll bring you up to the present and just mention a few words about my book at the end. So, here's the first scene of the movie, and this I will tell you because it is very quick. This is Consolidated Life. It is an insurance company in New York City, and it has over 32,000 employees, and C.C. Baxter, Jack Lemmon, is one of them. And what we see here at Consolidated Life is the critique of cultural conformity, of corporate conformity, and the alienation of white-collar work that was such a big topic at the end of at the sort of second half of the 1950s. Now, of course, the 1950s now occupy, a kind of special place in America. If we think about MAGA and nostalgia for the great America, that's that vision of the 50s. Of course, everything was not so great in the 50s, as I'm sure many of you know. But one of the things that was happening in the 50s was that although wages were going up a lot, productivity was high, money was not the problem of work. As people found their livelihoods were more secure, they became increasingly dissatisfied with their work lives, with meaning and the lack of meaning and alienated work, of course, something that Marx has talked a lot about, with the drudgery of work, with the lack of self-determination and autonomy at work. And this became a huge theme across the culture. And we have here some of the really classic works that identified the problem of corporate conformity and the problem of alienation related to the big corporations. So also a critique of bigness. First, The Organization Man, William White. And then the one that sort of had the biggest impact on the popular culture was a novel, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, made famous, of course, it was a best-selling book, but Gregory Peck, of course, starred in that movie, which was a huge hit. And then there's sort of a whole series. I've just put, some of my favorites here. My former colleague, Ken Galbraith, The Affluent Society, another critique of the big corporations. Vance Packard's Status Seekers, The Power Elite, C. Wright Mills, The Lonely Crowd. So sociological and economic critiques of what was going on. These were primarily about white-collar work, but it wasn't only white-collar work where the sort of feelings of alienation and rebellion against that alienation came. It was also happening in the factories and in blue-collar work. And blue-collar strikes began to happen in the 1960s and 70s. There was a huge postal workers strike in 1970. And by the end of the 1960s, the archetypal blue-collar place in America, Detroit, with the auto factories, were going up in tremendous what are called wildcat strikes, which are those are illegal, unauthorized strikes outside of the expiration of a contract. And so and those workers were getting the best money they'd ever had at that time, and those strikes were also about alienation and power and the lack of democracy and the meaninglessness that people were feeling at work. And there's a movie for that too, which was fantastic. Paul Schrader's directorial debut about alienated auto workers, highly recommended. Now, about 40 years ago, I started studying work time because this was another theme in what was happening in work in America at this time. So we have the alienation and the critique of corporate power, but there's also the fact that something was happening on the work time front which was wholly unexpected. And somebody just mentioned this to me outside. Richard Nixon, of all people, 1956, of course, he was vice president, says, GOP policies, we are going to go for a 4-day week. Why? Incredible productivity happening, productivity growth, the country getting richer and richer, and people were working so hard. And isn't it about time we use some of that productivity growth to give people a break? And as you will not be surprised, when I wrote a book about this, which came out in the early 1990s, instead we got The Overworked American. And we got, so the theme of long working hours is also present here in the apartment. I will mention one thing about one wonderful scene in it, which is there's a moment in the film when closing time at the insurance company happens, and the clock hits 5:20. And you remember that first picture I showed you, all 32,000 workers pop up from their desks immediately and rush out of the building. And of course, white-collar workers today would be amazed at the idea that first of all, that you can leave on the dot at a time, and that 5 o'clock was closing time. So we're gonna come back to that in a minute. But the other big theme after all those critiques of the 50s and 60s was the idea that we can enrich jobs. So there was within industrial relations and sociology, a huge movement to make work healthier for people and better for people. And this is a book by Robert Karasek called Healthy Work. He was a pioneer in studying what it was that creates stress and burnout at work. And he discovered there are really two things. One is how fast and how hard you have to work if you're turned into a machine, like if we think about modern times, back to films. But the other is how much discretion you have over what you do, how much autonomy do you have. So issues of democracy in the workplace, which were absolutely at the center of those struggles in the late 60s and 1970s. But then, of course, everything changed. And in 1980, we get the shift in our economy to neoliberal policies. Of course, lots been written about these, but really important dimensions for what was of neoliberal policies, much of which has to do with fiscal and monetary policy and so forth, but also they have a profound impact on what's happening in the workplace. And I have here a famous strike, the air traffic controllers strike, PATCO, as their union was called, which was famously broken and the union busted by Ronald Reagan. And I see people shaking their heads who remember that time. And that is really a kind of archetypal moment after which that earlier period that I talked about in which workers were getting rich along, or not richer, but they were gaining along with the bosses, along with the employers, that changes dramatically, and we get the beginnings of a long period of wage stagnation, of the hollowing out of the middle class, and what eventually comes to be the era that we're living in today, extreme inequality. So here's, I don't want to get too detailed on this, but if you look from 1948 till 73 is often seen as the dividing line, but it really opens up in the 80s, is productivity and compensation go up together. So when workers get more productive, they get the fruits of that productivity, and the companies do too, but it's a shared prosperity. Of course, that ends beginning with neoliberalism, so you see that flatlining of compensation in comparison to the growing of productivity. And this is especially true for the lower and middle wage earners. If you saw that in that previous graph, you might have said, well, wages went up a bit, but certainly not for those low-wage workers who for decades got no better off in real terms, the middle wage earners barely, and the wage gains that we see went very much to the upper end. And then just one more quick one, which is, of course, the change in wealth since the 2008 recession, because post that recession and the financial panic and collapse of 2007-8, we've seen the tremendous increase in the amount of wealth that's going to the very top 1%, and that bottom 50% getting nothing. So that leads, of course, to overall growing inequality. This is income inequality, declining share of income to the bottom half, and actually even more than that, and then that growth of that top 1%. At the same time, and not surprisingly, we're getting a rise of working hours. Not only did we not get the 4-day week and the leisure dividend, the crisis of leisure that people were worried about when I was writing my book, reading about the 1970s, people thought the problem would be that we had so much leisure time we wouldn't know what to do, and what were all those corporate executives, how much golf could they play? And there were books written about that. But there are lots of different years we could choose. I just picked this one because it's the top of a business cycle, 1979. Working hours move with the business cycle. 79 to 2007, just before the Great Recession, annual hours of work in the US rose by 180 hours a year. That's more than a month of work. And yes, there is cinema to go along with this era of the neoliberal time. So the diabolical bosses, the overwork, that poor Anne Hathaway who has no life of her own and she's at the beck and call. And of course, this is what starts to happen in the white collar jobs, which is technology means forget that bell ringing at 5 o'clock when you could go home. The home and the office have merged and there is no off. And I had the privilege of testifying to the Senate with the president of the UAW, Sean Fain, in the spring. And one of the things he talked about was how not only the forced overtime, but he said in American manufacturing, everybody is working 12-hour shifts, typically 6 days a week. So coming out of the Great Recession, things actually get worse. And they get worse because we get into a whole new era of work, which is the era of ultra precarity, and with Uber being the sort of archetypal employer. So we've gone from consolidated life, who you'll meet in a minute, to Uber, and here we have Uber drivers. Ubernomics is poverty for us and billions for them. I'm a driver, I deserve a living wage. And I spent about 15 years studying these Uber drivers and other platform workers, and my previous book was on them. Coming out of the pandemic, things have gotten even worse with that wealth inequality intensifying. Platform work has continued to expand, and now we have a film coming out in October by Aziz Ansari, and I was lucky enough to become be a sort of informal consultant to him because he plays a delivery worker in this, and the name of the film is Good Fortune. I think it's going to be really fun. All right, I'm going to finish up in a minute, but post-Uber, what's happening? Well, many of or at least some of the analysts of the platform work, and of course Uber itself, had the view, they started out with human beings driving these cars. Their view was overly optimistic in their point of view, that within a few years, all the data they were collecting from these drivers would make it possible for them to do away with the drivers, and we'd have the self-driving cars, which of course we do have, not here in Boston yet, but the idea that now, the future of work is the replacement of humans in jobs, and of course, that is the whole issue of AI, not just driverless cars, but pretty much everything. And if you haven't read that piece in the New York Times business section about evil AI that I read today, I'm not sure if it was I think it was in today's paper, maybe it was in yesterday's. I highly recommend it. It's a really terrifying. But of course, it's important for us to know. AI and jobs, and what is AI going to do to the workplace? We don't know the answer to that. Let me just also mention a wonderful movie I saw here at the Coolidge when it first came out, which was Her. And that brings us to my most recent book, which says there is a way forward. And I think one of the things we're seeing coming out of the pandemic was an increasing number of employers realizing that burning out their workers and stressing them out really wasn't helping them, and that we're back to, in some ways, we've come full circle back to that idea that we need to have a more humane workplace. And I had the privilege of studying, being the lead researcher for trials of companies around the world. We have more than 10,000 employees in these trials, about 375 companies that have given their employees 4-day work weeks, 32 hours, what Nixon was talking about back in the 50s, 0 reduction in pay. And not only do the employees find it amazing, life-changing, transformational, the best thing that ever happened to me. You know, I finally could go to the doctor, and I found out I had cancer, and if I had still been working 5 days, I wouldn't have gone. Or the women who tell us that they're able to get pregnant now because they're not working so hard, and on and on and on. But also the incredible success stories that we're hearing from the companies, the vast majority of whom stay on these schedules permanently. So the book is the story of these trials, the experiences of the worker, the employees, of the companies. How is AI going to fit into all of this? And what about the climate crisis? And if we work less, won't that help the climate? And what we can expect going forward. So I hope you have a chance to take a look at the book and maybe think about these things as we now have the opportunity for a really delightful, wonderful experience with Billy Wilder. Thank you.